Hi boys and girls, it's Mr. Vanover, and welcome to our homework recap and assistance video. That's what we're going to call this. So what this is going to be about is whether or not there are economic problems that exist in the national economy at the time of rapid industrialization and all that expansion that we've talked about. So what we're really looking at is there a growing economic crisis in the late 19th century, which is kind of what your homework had to do with, your classwork, excuse me. So what we're going to look at is we're going to be looking at whether or not there really is this kind of a crisis. I'm going to tell you that historians generally think they are, but you have to be able to say why there is one, which is very important for the APUSH world. So we'll start off first with looking kind of at a recap of what may have been done in class today, which would be looking at some of the premises that we go with going into the lesson that you did in class, and then kind of giving you some next step directions and a few new pieces of information that you might want to look at. Okay, so getting into what we would have done in class today, and if you were absent, this can help you out a little bit, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because you can get some of these notes from others. And this really just kind of applies to first and fourth got to have this discussion pretty well today, November 6th, 2017. Second period had some very pointed questions that kind of went outside what I was trying to do in this particular case. So this might be some new stuff to you. But a couple of things we looked at was we looked at the concept of what is capitalism to review from your homework over the weekend, which is you were supposed to watch that kind of cheesy 1948 video about capitalism, and obviously there's a little bit of Cold War significance into that, but it also was meant to show you how an economist would look at capitalism and define how that works. So that's one of those things that's really important to look at in regard to understanding the definition of capitalism from that particular video. We also would talk about what a corporation is and exactly how a corporation is supposed to function. And I will do a little bit of recap on that in another slide here in just a minute. So I won't spend too much time on that. Then going back to your homework again, we were going to look at how these concepts relate to the economic theories or political theories that involve classical liberalism and the idea that there is a free marketplace and that the government should not be involved in regulating the marketplace, at least in these theories. And then we wanted to look at maybe rugged individualism and the idea that anybody could have the success of wealth and high standard of living, I guess you could say, maybe even to the extent of the industrialists you're reading about, as long as they worked hard and they were willing to put in the time and the money and the blood, sweat, and tears involved with doing that. So that's kind of what's behind the idea of rugged individualism when it comes to this particular time period. It has some other applications in different ways later, but we'll talk more about that when those subjects. Of course, this is APUSH, and so we do have to be mindful of some of our disciplinary skills and tools for historians that we talk about all the time. And of course, one of the things that we want to do for this lesson is contextualize. So what better way than to review a skill for APUSH than to look at what contextualization is according to the good people at the College Board in the AP program. So remember that they're going to want you to be able to describe a historical context for any kind of specific development or process. And that's kind of at a minimal level, is to be able to just describe what's happening at the time. They're going to want you to explain how what's happening at the time may influence something, either a specific development, a specific historical event, or a certain kind of concept or process, as they put it. And then be able to explain the significance of something that happens in history when you contain it within the context of what's happening at the time. So it's kind of like being able to situate the topic within time and place. and being able to understand what that means in terms of helping to explain a prompt or a topic that you've been given in APUSH. I'm going to situate what this particular context is going into the lesson, and that is essentially that we're going to look at a couple of things here that we've already discussed in class, but make sure that we're at a common place. One of the things is, as we talked about how a corporation was formed, and when you form a corporation, or in this case, the verb would be incorporate, we know that you would get this by the granting of a state charter. Depending on the state that one is in, the state has certain requirements of incorporation. But the state would grant a charter of incorporation, and a company or business at that point would become the equivalent of an artificial legal person. And it's important to remember with that they're not literally a person, but that there is, on paper, the business is the equivalent of what a person would be. And you and I and everybody else in this nation, there is a legal status that the state would grant a business that basically puts them in the same category on paper as a legal person would be. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind, because that means that the owner of the business person, then has a limited liability in operating their business. The owner themselves exist separately from the business when something is incorporated. We talked about this with the market revolution, because we talked about the fact that certain incorporation laws granted this kind of status in various states, and was seen as being something that encouraged the development of early industries that become part of what we call the market revolution, and fuel that relationship between increased production and this shift to a market economy. So we still have this concept when we get to the late 19th century. It takes on a kind of a new form, though. But one of the things to remember is, if a business fails in a corporate situation, or if a business is to be sued, as another example, the owner only loses the money that they have put into that individually. The business itself is what is sued, or the business itself is what fails, because it is on paper the same as a person. So what this means is that there is some limited liability as to how much this would affect the daily life of the individual who has incorporated the business. Now, one of the questions that's going to come up in this particular time period is how the 14th Amendment plays into this. And that's a very, very relevant question, because the 14th Amendment is one of those amendments that come out of the Civil War, that does not necessarily have to do only with the rights and the process of freeing former slaves. The 14th Amendment comes into play quite a bit outside of simply the issue of what was going on with slavery prior to the Civil War. Now, there's some advantages to incorporating that have been kind of talked about, but one of the things you can do when you incorporate is that you have the opportunity to bring together the wealth of different individuals to invest in the business, and everybody can invest and be considered the equivalent of kind of a partial owner, but they too have limited liability in terms of, if the business fails, they lose their money, they lose their investment, but they don't necessarily say lose their house to make them pay for any of the bills the business has. So there is that limited liability for investors, as well as the person who at least starts off by incorporating. And if a business got to the point where it was profitable and growing enough, it could actually sell stock to earn more money to be able to give to the business and grow the business, and use the stock income to invest in the company even further and allow it to grow. The corporation also has perpetual life. If I start a corporation today, I am not going to end that corporation tomorrow if I got hit by a bus. The corporation will live beyond me until at some point it is no longer chartered. So if you were all my business partners and you all invested into my business and we have formed a corporation, if I die, the corporation lives on and you all can still run the business, and there's no disruption to how that all works legally. The disadvantages, however, your financial records are public. You have to turn those over to the state. Those records are considered a matter of public record, and anybody can see how you're doing. And if you're not doing well, then that's not always a fun thing to have to put out there. The other thing is that corporations can become too large. And one of the things that you have to look at with regard to the classwork we did today is what are the effects if a business grows too large. Think back to that video that you watched as part of your homework and what happened with the clothing store when the man who owned it was the only owner and the business was doing quite well. And then today, we know that corporations are taxed at a higher rate than what would be just individual income tax. So if I start a business and I incorporate, the corporation pays a tax and I pay taxes on my income to me. So it's a complicated thing that you don't have to worry much about today, but just to give you some sort of idea of how these things work in modern day, but it won't be something you have to know in regard to history. So, we talked about these things just to make sure that they're kind of recapped. Now, here's the premise. Businesses are generally established by individuals or maybe partners. They get together the money to establish and run their business. The growth for this business model tends to be moderate, and rapid growth can be really difficult due to certain business limitations. And something else that's important to keep in mind here is when rapid industrialization does hit this country, increased production tends to lead to more goods being available on the market. And you should remember a concept we've talked about several times of supply and demand. That when there's an increase of supply without an increase in demand, we're going to see prices increase. So businesses, some people believe, can become unstable in a time when we have increased production due to, say, rapid industrialization. And that's one of the things we're going to look at. So when we look at economic crisis, remember that post-Civil War, the economy is supposed to be very unstable, and that goes back to a Vanover historical truism. Until we get to World War II, every major conflict generally tends to follow the conflict with a decrease in economic activity. We see inflationary economy during the war that maintains into the post-war period, and the turn down in production tends to cause a problem with regard to economic stability. Business performance is very unpredictable. Profits are frequently suffering. And if we look at the business cycle, say maybe document D, we can see the panics are occurring each decade. We see plunging stock prices. We see businesses and banks failing. And economic growth either halts or recedes in like a recession. For example, we have the Panic of 1873. That leads to a 5-year depression in the United States where the economy fell and it stayed depressed and did not pull out until roughly around 1878. And we can see that from 1893 to 1897, there's a severe depression in this country that is probably the worst before the Great Depression comes, which is, of course, in the 1930s, and the Great Depression is going to basically outdo anything that the Depression of 1893 saw. Okay, so for classwork today, what you were supposed to do is look at the packet Growing Economic Crisis of the late 19th century, and I wanted you to look at parts A, B, and C. And then using that information from the documents or any supplemental information from either the textbook resources or if you were to go online, looking at you completing that activity. And some of you got to varying degrees of what was actually completed. But in the end, what you want to know is what was the crisis and how did the documents show you anything to do with the crisis? and why was there a crisis, and what was done about the crisis. So this is kind of a part A of a story that keeps kind of coming back up through the rest of our unit, and we'll get to that. But right now, I'll give you a little bit of background over some of the finer points of the activity, since it doesn't always stand out at everybody. So the problems that are supposed to exist have to do with rapid industrialization and the fact that the government had kind of no contingency plans for such a thing. It didn't anticipate it becoming such a thing in life. So there's this idea that the business world maybe expanded too fast, and that because of this unprecedented growth, that there's a need to perhaps control what was going on with the expansion. But the government is not involved with this because it had no contingency plans. So business, big business, if you want to look at it that way, had a goal of trying to find what they thought was necessary order and stability in the economy. And that's the theme of the documents that you looked at in class. If you look at the documents, there's this idea that there is a continuous business cycle that can be ruinous to competition and ruinous to just business in general. There's this idea that there's too much competition out there. There's the idea that too much competition has caused oversupply in the marketplace, and that oversupply is ruining prices and making it so that no one can be profitable. And then in the end, the huge danger is that the businesses as a whole will fail, the industry will fail, and then what will that get anyone? And that's some of the theme that's running through those documents. So what you saw is basically a argument that was put out by the various industrialists that somewhat lay out the idea that there is a crisis in the economy because the economy is unstable due to too much competition. The economy is unstable due to prices being lowered due to an oversupply in the market, and there is no real plan in place to deal with this. So the business people start to investigate, and they begin to put their efforts into business combinations that they feel are necessary in order to keep the economy afloat and to actually eliminate some amount of competition in the name of the greater good of the economy. And as some of these business practices that we're going to look at emerge, what you're going to find is that there's greater concern. Remember the feudin' and a fussin'. There's greater concern over what these practices mean and how they impact overall society. And that's going to become where you read, for example, the business owners stating the documents, the information you saw in the documents today in class. And you're going to find other people aren't quite as understanding of their justifications. So, first of all, we need to know monopoly. A monopoly is essentially any time where you have an absence or an elimination of any competition. And I think that what many of you are asking was in class today was about when does a monopoly happen, or what causes a monopoly to form. And there are different ways in which to arrive at a situation in which competition is eliminated. Now, don't be fooled that we're talking about all competition everywhere at every time in the economy. There can be a monopoly that occurs economy-wide for really big industries, and there can be there can be monopolies that occur even in a given area. Sometimes the monopolies are accidental. They're not done by any means of trying to have no competition by any one company. It could be the condition of the economy as a whole. It could be bad business practices by your competitors that don't allow for them to stay in business. There are any number of ways a monopoly can form. But what we see is that the gist of this time period is that industrialists are going to argue that they had to work to eliminate competition because the marketplace was too volatile and threatened the entire economy if there were no steps taken by these industrialists. One of the ways they did this was through what's called a pool, and you saw this on your particular activity in class today, and that's where you have competitors agree to basically fix prices and perhaps even output. So they might all agree that they're only going to make so many widgets and gadgets, and that's it. They will then voluntarily limit the supply in the marketplace, and therefore they won't oversupply, and that will not then result with prices dropping to the point of it not being competitive. Or competitors will agree to fix prices, and by fixing these prices, they then essentially stabilize the market so that the prices don't fall from one of them trying to undercut the other, and therefore there's no effect of supply and demand in a marketplace, or there's no effect of competition lowering prices so as to make the entire field become unprofitable and risk its existence. A trust is another way of essentially combining businesses in order to try to essentially manage the competition. And essentially, in a trust, one individual, for example, might get all of their competitors to turn over the stock to a holding company or so, or like a company that has a common board of trustees. And then that would entitle the trust to have shares of profits for all of the companies. And so what you find, though, is that that board of trustees also then makes the decisions for all of the companies, and they can limit the amount of competition in the marketplace at that time. You get a holding company, which is kind of a form of a trust, which is they are an individual company that will purchase and will hold stock in different companies, and then they'll control their actions. So if I want to start some sort of method of maybe trying to get some control in my marketplace, say oil, then I might form a separate company that's called a holding company, and I'll try to purchase enough stock that I get controlling interest in those companies, or at least a significant amount of influence, and I might be able to control their particular actions so as to limit the competition in the marketplace, and therefore not necessarily eliminate all of the companies that are part of my market, say oil, but I can limit the number of people that are competing with me to the extent that we all have some sort of existence, and we don't all go out of existence because we keep lowering our prices to the point we can't stay in business. There's also what's called the interlocking directorate, and that's when an individual may serve on the board of directors for more than one corporation, and as a member of these various boards of directors for, say, all of the oil industry, every oil company that's out there, one person serves on the board of directors for all of them, then there is some sort of influence being had by one particular person on the entire marketplace. There's also the merger, and a merger was huge in the 1980s. And the idea of a merger is that you find a way to consolidate two separate companies into one single corporation. You see mergers all the time. In the airline industry, for example, United Airlines, that is actually its current form is United Airlines merged with Continental Airlines, and then both airlines became one company and was known just as United. And so mergers happen all the time. And sometimes it's done up through a purchasing of stock. Sometimes, at least in the time period that we're looking at in APUSH period 6, there were various ways in which a company could be merged into another and could then, again, eliminate a competitor by taking them over. So what we're talking about here is essentially forms of business consolidation. So consolidation is just a fancy word of saying combination. They're combining businesses together in some way or fashion as to limit the number of players in the marketplace. So you learned about vertical integration. Well, integration is another way of saying that word consolidation. So vertical consolidation / vertical integration, depending on the source you're seeing, are the same ideas. And that's the idea that one company owns all levels of production within one given industry. So if you're looking at bringing one product to market, one company will own every step necessary to bring that product to market. Whereas with horizontal consolidation or horizontal integration, you have one company that will expand its ownership in one of those steps in bringing a product to market. One area of that production process they will control, and therefore they exercise an extraordinary amount of influence over that particular industry. In terms of everybody on the marketplace eventually has to filter through one company for one of those steps of production, and that gives them a ton of influence and allows them to have some sort of say in an industry that may be considered anti-competitive. So if you're looking at oil, for example, here is a 5-step simplified process to try to show where vertical or horizontal integration can take place. So if you look at these 5 steps, from step 1 at the bottom here, so if we're looking at step 1 at the bottom, you're looking at the idea of having raw materials are pumped from the ground, oil, and if you remember when I gave you the analogy of oil production for note-taking, you might remember oil out of the ground is worthless. It just doesn't, it might burn, but it doesn't really have a specific application as it's put there. Then you have to take that transportation from one location to another and move crude oil or oil out of the ground to oil refineries. So you got to either send it through a pipeline, or you got to have somebody like, in this case, horse and buggy, or trains, perhaps, sending oil in tanks to the oil refinery. And an oil refinery is where they process oil. So they turn raw oil out of the ground, which is not really useful to anything, into things like kerosene for heating, or lubricating oils, or even certain types of what they call paraffin, like waxes. Vaseline is actually a petroleum byproduct. If you look at it, it's called petroleum jelly. And that is all done through the refining process. Then you got to take it to wherever that's going to be sold, and then people buy it. So if you look at vertical consolidation or vertical integration, one company will own the oil fields, they'll own the pipelines or the tanker trucks to get them to a certain place, they'll own their own refineries, they will literally own their own locomotives and train cars in which to haul the oil to the finished market. And then let's say if we're looking at gasoline, they'll put that gasoline in their gas stations. And then they have control of the costs from the beginning to the end. And that makes them immensely more competitive and perhaps able to bring a much lower cost to consumers to the point where they can run the competition out of business. This in and of itself does not mean it's a monopoly. When you're looking at the vertical consolidation, it doesn't mean that there's definitely a monopoly. It doesn't mean that there's a monopoly. It means that there's an ability to form an absence of. And to keep in mind, when you're looking at why vertical consolidation or vertical integration is important to know, because it's a way one company can get an advantage in the marketplace. In the meantime, with horizontal, The horizontal integration is going to be something that is important in the sense that it gives that one company, in this case the refinery, an immense amount of control over things. So first of all, that is a monopoly on refining, and therefore every drop of oil, no matter who is the person, the company that's selling it, no matter which company sells it, every drop of oil in, say, the United States will go through one refining company. And they essentially have a massive amount of influence on the market, and they can put various other companies out of business and maybe limit it to just their preferred company, or use that as a means to finally gain control over all of them. So there's different ways in which this can happen, but AP is going to want you to know the difference between them, and they're going to want you to know that the point of any of this is to understand that these are ways in which companies try to gain control of the marketplace. And look at how they did that. If you look here, starting in 1895, there weren't lots of mergers happening, but as you get to the end of our time period in 1898, you've set up a situation in which there are massive corporate mergers in the United States. And then you can see that they begin to fall, and that's going to be part of what's APUSH period 7. And we take a look at that in a little more detail later, but you can see that this is definitely something that was a massive effort on the part of industrialists in the economy. Looking at just iron and steel firms, if you look at 1870, so just 5 years after the end of the Civil War, you can see that there were 808 firms that existed in the United States that had about 78,000 employees. You can see that when you get to 1900, that number has dropped dramatically to 669 firms with 272,000 employees, and they are able to make more steel or iron at that time than they possibly could have before. So you can see that there's obviously an efficiency in the business when you're looking at the ways in which this becomes such a massive way of looking at business and its capabilities. So what's all this fussing and a feuding about? If you take a look at it, what you find is you need to think about, before the next class, what relationship exists between the concept of supply and demand, the ideas of classical liberalism, and the belief that there was an economic crisis at this time. Ultimately, you got to put some of these ideas that we've been working toward together. And then when you think about chapter 24, think about which specific historical examples from chapter 24 can be used to show the results of this. Where can you see results of this relationship that exists between these particular concepts? That's a key piece of information that you need.